And welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. All throughout the month of November, we're aiming to bring you a brand new review each and every day. Now, it might be a written review over on thegaminggang.com, or it might be yours truly with a video review. And today, I'm about to share my thoughts about Never Going Home from Wet Ink Games. This is written by Brandon K. Otten, Matthew Orr, Erwin Jackson, Sarah Orr Otten, Taylor White, Corey Capps, Crystal Mazer, and Stephen Wu, with the artwork provided by Charles Ferguson-Avery and William Knox Gunn. This 114-page softcover with PDF can be had over at DriveThruRPG, carries an MSRP of $20, or you can grab just the PDF alone for $10. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got Never Going Home. A few things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, the fine folks over at Wet Ink Games were kind enough to provide me with this review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. These days, it's important you know that. Well, it's not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I do want to give you a really good feel for what you're going to find inside this core rule book. Now, there are a trio of adventures which are contained within, but they are mainly text. So I'm not too concerned about ruining any of the surprises or spoiling anything because you're really not going to see anything as I flip on through anyway. All right, so let's jump on in. First thing we're going to do, let's take a peek at the credits page. A lot of folks work very hard to bring this to life. So let's give them credit where credit is due. Never Going Home is an interesting role-playing game. Now, I had heard of it. I had heard the premise of Never Going Home. I had never actually gotten a chance to take a peek at it, but I lucked out because Wet Ink Games was exhibiting at Gamehole Con, and I had an opportunity to chat with a couple of the fellows over there, and I got this review copy. So very sweet. So the premise is this is the First World War with supernatural elements. So effectively, the Battle of the Somme, all the pain, death, all the suffering is weakened this veil that separates our reality from this other dimension, this other reality. And these supernatural horrors known as the others are crossing over into our reality. And the soldiers who are fighting in the Great War, their humanity is also being worn away, not only by the combat and the trench warfare, but also these supernatural elements. So it's possible that the humans who are fighting each other might end up gaining corruption that then makes them one of the others. And they leave humanity and they cross back over the veil. Or maybe they become a monster that the rest of the players will have to fight later on in their campaign. So pretty interesting. I really like the premise. There is a skirmish war game that I reviewed recently from Osprey Games called A War Transformed, which has a similar premise, although that is more folk horror taking place during World War I, because it's the return of ancient pagan gods and beings and things like that, where this is more supernatural in nature because these are horrific creatures from really another dimension which are crossing over into ours. So this utilizes what's known as the 1+ system of mechanics, and it utilizes a dice pool of 6-sided dice as well as standard playing cards. And depending on the number of players, you might need a second deck of playing cards. And the playing cards are a commodity that the player characters will have. And those playing cards actually represent their humanity. And as they spend those cards for various different things, they're losing their humanity. They're losing memories or sense of self, things like that. Pretty cool premise. As far as the dice pool, what you're looking at is having 3 attributes for the player characters. We've got brawn, wits, and guts. And you will have 10 points when you create your character to break up into those 3 attributes. There's also skills. So you'll have 3 points to put into skills. And if you want, you can put 3 points into one skill or break it up 1 point into 3 skills. It's completely up to you. So what'll happen is when you attempt to do something that has some chance of failure or something that's relatively difficult, you're going to be facing a target number of successes. Now, when you roll a 6-sided die, if you get a 5 or a 6, that is a success. And you might need to roll 3 or 4 or 5 successes. And usually you're not going to be having a huge handful of dice to be rolling. So essentially, if you're using a skill, the number of points you have in that skill are going to be the number of dice you get to roll. But the thing is, each of the skills is tied into one of those attributes. And those attributes actually give you various modifications you can take to your dice. So you can add additional dice. You can add dice into a skill that you're unskilled in. Quite a bit going on with the mechanics, and pretty interesting too. When I first started taking a peek, I thought, oh, hey, pretty rules-light game. But then as I got further into the mechanics, I thought, well, wait a second. There's a little bit of crunch here that I didn't see right away. And I would say this is kind of a midweight, because it's certainly not as crunchy as Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder, or anything like that. But it's certainly not just a quick dice pool sort of game where it's like, oh, you get 3 dice and you need to roll 5 or 6. And there you go. No, not at all. I should also point out that the way this is laid out is not very intuitive. I was really surprised. The way this is laid out does not make learning how to play Never Going Home easy. Just to start off with, we get an example of combat. We get some other things that we have no idea what's going on because we don't have rules of play yet. We don't have our character creation rules yet. Those are later on in the book. So I thought just the way things are laid out, the order things are laid out is really strange. Love the artwork throughout. I think the artwork is very cool. I think it's also interesting that we never actually get to see anyone's face. The faces are always either hidden or they're behind gas masks of various different styles. I like that quite a bit. As far as the actual text presentation, kind of bland. I mean, you'll run into some pages where it's just unbroken text carrying on for a few pages before we might get some artwork or we get notes and things like that. In my opinion, the biggest selling point of Never Going Home is going to be its setting. I think it's very interesting that the game itself is party focused. So each of the characters will have time to shine in the spotlight, but the big deal is the unit. So characters are going to come and go. They're going to join the unit. They're going to die, but it's the survival of the units that is in the forefront of the game. Now, the players will embark on missions, and within these missions will be various different incidents that take place. So at least the way the adventures are laid out in this core rule book, they are pretty linear and they are scene-based as well, which I've got no issue with that. I'm just pointing out that this isn't a sandbox game by any stretch of the imagination. Get a lot of information, the historic aspects, as well as what's going on with the weakening of the veil and the others coming across. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the player characters can earn corruption. If they have 5 points of corruption, they actually become one of the others, and they're no longer under the control of a player. They might just leave humanity. They might cross over the veil. Maybe later on down the line, they become an enemy of the unit that the unit has to fight. So I thought that's kind of cool. As far as our stat blocks, pretty easy to understand, kind of bland though, to be very honest. We do have a bit of a bestiary here. It's not extensive, but it's important to keep in mind that Never Going Home has tons of supplemental material. I was really surprised on how much supplemental material is out there. Now, granted, Never Going Home has been out for a few years, but still, it's got loads of splat books. It's got loads of expansions and supplements. And I think that's really cool. And I would hope that some of the later books maybe clean up the presentation, especially of the mechanics. Because once again, as I mentioned, just reading through this book, it's not as intuitive in learning the 1+ system and mechanics as it could have been. Now, something else that's kind of interesting with these 1+ mechanics is you'll have a hand of cards. Each of the players will have a hand of cards for their characters. The game master does not. And those cards can be used for a lot of different things. You can use them for initiative in combat, where if you play one of the cards, the higher the number means that player is going to determine who goes first. Not necessarily that they are going to go first. They get to determine who is going to go first in combat. I thought that was kind of interesting. They can spend cards to heal wounds. They can spend cards to help manipulate their dice that they roll, which is also something that they'll do with their attributes. So as far as the manipulation, you can re-roll dice. You can add pips to your die that was rolled. So remember, a 5 or a 6 is a success. So if you have a 4, if you manipulate that die to a 5, well, it becomes a success as opposed to a failure. So like I said, really interesting how the mechanics work, but the way they're presented here are a little clunky. That's all. We do get the 3 adventures. The 3 adventures are pretty interesting. I would say that they're not necessarily going to blow your socks off, but they are going to make for a nice introduction, not only to the mechanics, but also to the setting. So I like that quite a bit. And I do understand that there are other supplements that will delve far deeper into the various different nationalities. So as an example, like the Doughboys from the United States, they are included in a supplement that's out there. Funny enough, the war still ends in 1918. Kind of interesting, right? So the veil weakens in 1916. The war will still end in 1918. Then we wrap up with our character sheet, kind of bland, but it basically gets the job done. So there you have a peek inside Never Going Home. Let's swing on over to the other camera. I'm going to share some final thoughts and give this a review score. So there's a lot to like about Never Going Home. I think its biggest selling point is the setting. I think it's very cool. I got to be honest, if you've actually picked up a War Transformed from Osprey Games and you're using that skirmish miniatures rule system, you might take a peek at Never Going Home for some inspiration, or maybe for like spells and things like that, because we have spells here. They're called whispers. You have to spend some of your humanity to cast those spells. Thought that was pretty interesting as far as that goes. But like I said, I think its big selling point is just the game world and the setting. And I would be really interested to learn more about it. Now, once again, the presentation outside of the cool artwork is relatively bland and it's not very intuitive. This isn't a rules-like game. Now, when you first start reading this core rulebook, you might sit there thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. Then when you actually get into the rules of play, you're like, oh, wait a second. There's a little more to this than I thought, which is fine. I've got no issues with that whatsoever. Another aspect of Never Going Home, which works to its advantage, is the sheer amount of supplemental material out there. Pretty impressive. Like I said, I'd be interested in checking more of that out. But as far as this as a core rulebook, I do like it. I don't think it's going to necessarily be for everyone, especially considering the game world and the setting and the premise of the role-playing game itself. But it is pretty interesting. And I do believe that if this is something that piques your interest, you will enjoy playing Never Going Home. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I give Never Going Home's core rulebook a 6.5 out of 10. All right, that's it for this time out. If you liked the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell. It'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit gaminggang.com for our latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find here on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer, and until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you out there get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.